We don't like to talk about it or think about it, and we sure don't like to go through it. But the truth of the matter is that life has a dark side. There are factors and forces that act on us, in us, and around us that cause pain. People can be brutal, cruel, dishonest. We disappoint ourselves. Sometimes even our best efforts fall short, and we are left with the pain and the emptiness that comes from having tried our best and failed. On the other hand, sometimes we disappoint ourselves by not living up to the values we believe in. We prefer to think that power is sought and gained and used to advance loving and just purposes, but there is a dark side to power holding and power seeking and power wielding. Some people seek and hold and wield power for purposes that are unloving and unjust. So this sermon is about the dark side of realities of life that we don't like to think about or talk about and definitely don't like to experience. In 1 Kings 19, the prophet Elijah takes center stage. Elijah was the prophet who denounced the idolatry and the injustice of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel of Israel. Who names their daughters Jezebel? The reason is because one was enough. Jezebel of the Old Testament was enough to stop people from naming their daughters Jezebel. Elijah stood up for justice and truth when Jezebel had a man murdered so that Ahab could take his property. Ahab wanted the guy's vineyard, and the guy wouldn't sell. Jezebel said, "You're the king, dude. I can get the vineyard for you." So she had the man killed. She said, "Go get the vineyard." Jezebel didn't play. Elijah predicted a national drought that lasted for 3 years. Elijah challenged the royal regime and its priests to a public test on Mount Carmel, where God sent fire from the sky and convinced a wayward people they were following a governmentally sponsored and religiously inspired lie. That's not the last time that a governmentally sponsored and religiously inspired lie was ever forced on a people. Afterwards, Elijah led the assembled multitude in killing Jezebel's prophets. Elijah was one of those guys who could pray and fight. Elijah prayed, and God sent a heavy rain to end the drought. Elijah was faithful, he was courageous, he was prayerful, but in today's lesson, the darkness had overtaken and threatened to overwhelm Elijah. The dark side realities of life had caught up to him. You see, after Jezebel learned that of her prophets being killed and Elijah's powerful victory on Mount Carmel, she swore to find Elijah and kill him. The man whose prayer had led to the end of a 3-year drought and whose God had been affirmed by the Israelites after that great victory on Mount Carmel was now an enemy of the state. He was a criminal with a royal death warrant on his head. He was a fugitive. Fearing Jezebel's wrath, Elijah and his servant left Israel and went south into the neighboring Judah. Elijah left his servant in Judah, in Beersheba, and then traveled alone for a day in the wilderness. And there he stopped and prayed to die. Elijah prayed to die. He had stood against a corrupt and wicked regime. He'd won a mighty victory for God against the empire and its priests at Mount Carmel. But in a short time, Elijah went from victorious prophet to being a prophet under a royal death warrant and with a personal death wish, and he just wanted to die. It was just that dark for him. Which brings me to the first point in this lesson. Faithfulness has a dark side. Faithfulness has a dark side. No matter how painful it may be to accept, faithfulness does not always or even often result in prosperity or popularity. I know the proponents of the prosperity gospel say it's not so. They haven't read much scripture. There is a dark side to faithfulness. Elijah had shown fidelity to God. He had been faithful. He had shown personal courage in the face of political power. He had sacrificed much for a long time only to find himself a wanted and hunted man. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't popular. He just only had one prayer now. Lord, please let me die. It's enough. I don't want to see anymore. I don't want to do anymore. Let me out. Faithfulness in the face of entrenched opposition is physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually draining. Elijah was worn out, depressed, and alone. Those are dark side realities of faithful living. If you stand up for right, if you are faithful, don't expect you're going to find yourself surrounded by a fan club. Unless you're fanning yourself. And sometimes, if you look at Elijah, you don't have the strength to fan yourself. Elijah didn't have strength to fan himself. Elijah also appears to have been overcome with a sense of defeat and despair. Perhaps he wondered about the benefit of defeating and killing Jezebel's idolatrous prophets. After all, Jezebel and Ahab remained in power. Jezebel had put him at the top of her most wanted list. His feat in Mount Carmel hadn't put her out of business. Instead, he was on the run. She wasn't running, he was. That may have felt like defeat, not victory. Faithfulness always demands our sacrificial efforts, and those efforts sometimes expose us to painful risks. The weight of sacrificial efforts and the mental and moral and spiritual strain from those efforts and the physical drain and the bruises we experience in those efforts take a toll on us. We become vulnerable to depression, where we lose interest in life and the things that ordinarily inspire us. Eventually, we can even lose hope. And this appears to be what happened to Elijah. He was worn out. He was burned out. He was despised, condemned, hunted, alone, depressed, and thought he'd failed. Elijah didn't consider himself a champion for God, despite all he had done, but a failure. Feelings of depression and failure and worthlessness and pain can be dark side realities for faithful people. And we can't wish those dark side realities away. We can't wish wicked and corrupt people away. We can't pretend they don't influence the way people treat us and what happens around and to us. The folks who tell you, baby, if you had good religion, you wouldn't feel that way, haven't been around long enough. You can have good religion and have the first-class case of blues. You don't believe me? Go to Gethsemane and find Jesus on his knees praying, Lord, let this cup pass from me. If you don't believe me, go to Calvary and listen to Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me? And the lesson from 1 Kings 19 shows that God doesn't try to hide the fact and the force of dark side realities from us. People who pretend that life doesn't have dark side realities are trying to fool themselves or others, and they don't do a good job of any case. But is there some good news? That's the question. Or do we, like Elijah, reach the point where either we throw up our hands and find ourselves a corner and have a pity party, or worse, throw up our hands and, like Elijah, pray for an end to it all? Which brings me to my second point. God knows our situation and cares about us. Whenever the darkness of life presses on us, we're tempted to believe, like Elijah, that we're alone. You ever been there? Felt that? Just me and my pity party. Me and all my problems came to be together. me and the bills, me and the sickness, me and this bad relationship, me and all of my stuff. At verses 10 and 14 of 1 Kings 19, we read his words, I alone am left. Add the Griffin paraphrase, I'm left with all this mess, God. I'm left with Jezebel chasing me down. I'm left, run out of my own country. I'm left with nothing. The dark side of life can leave us feeling alone and abandoned with our bills, leaving us alone and abandoned with our illness, alone and abandoned with our troubles, our struggle against oppression, our trouble against power, our struggle against injustice, and simply alone and abandoned with our dark side realities. But Elijah wasn't alone. The scripture says he lay down and went to sleep, but awakened from what he thought would be his final sleep to find an angel and food. Angels are divine messengers to us. Angels come to affirm us and call us and assure us and guide us and provide for us and renew us. Angels don't come on their own notions, but they are sent to us. They come because God knows our situation and cares about us. Sometimes they are family members with a divine sense of our pain and God's concern for us. Sometimes they're professional counselors and therapists who help us look past the darkness and minister to our wounded minds and tired spirits and our tired bodies and feelings of defeat and unworthiness. Sometimes they show up with a covered dish or a potted plant, as the old folks say, a little piece of money, or simply a listening ear and a friendly face. The point is that angels show up because God knows our dark side realities and cares about us. We matter to God, you see. Our struggles matter. Our sense of worth matters. Our sacrifice matters. Angels show up because God is with us even as we wrestle on the dark side of life. Angels show up because the darkness cannot hide us from God and cannot keep God from us. Angels show up to be useful to God with us. Elijah went to sleep tired, defeated, ready to die. He thought he was useless. He awakened twice to find free food prepared and a jar of water for new strength. You don't feed somebody that's useless. He got food and water because he was still useful to God. Angels enter into our darkness, bringing strength from God for us, and abide with us in the darkness while we gain new strength to press onward. All this happens by God's grace, not because we earned it, nor because we will it. In fact, angels show up even when our enemies don't want them to. Jezebel had a death threat out on her head, and angel shows up. And Jezebel couldn't do a thing about it. Have you ever had a dark side moment or season when you somehow didn't have the strength and somehow some strength came you didn't call for? Have you been alone and found yourself encouraged by an uninvited visitor, somebody you hadn't expected showed up with a good word and an encouraging spirit? Have you been inspired to enter into someone's darkness to comfort and encourage and nurture them? You know what an angel's like then. Yeah. That's angel work. These experiences are like the angelic visitation that Elijah received in the wilderness. They remind us we are not alone. They remind us that God is our strength and our refuge. They remind us that God knows our plight and our place. Angels find us because God sees us. Angels help us because God loves us. Angelic forces and people are good news for the dark side of life to remind us that God knows about our situation and cares for us. And the last thing I need to tell you is that God's bread of life is stronger than our darkness. Let me shift our focus from a wilderness cave somewhere in Judah to the seaside village called Capernaum, where Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. In that statement, Jesus declared himself to be for the world what the bread in that wilderness cave represented for Elijah. Jesus is God's sent strength for life that is stronger than our darkness. The big issue, you see, is not whether there is darkness, but whether there is a force and a source of strength in our lives that is stronger than the darkness. When life presses in and bears down on us, is there a force stronger than the darkness that can and will sustain us? When shadows of grief and guilt or sorrow cloud our lives, is there a stronger source of joy and hope that can burn through our despair? When the forces of oppression and injustice seem to control everything we see, is there a greater power that strengthens us to rise up anyway, look up anyway, carry on anyway, and overcome anyway? And the answer comes, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Jesus appears in John's gospel as God's bread, God's food, God's strength, God's sustenance for our living despite the darkness. Despite every dark reality and the powers behind them, Jesus declares himself to be strength from God that will not be vanquished. Jesus affirms himself to be God's food for hope that will not leave us empty. Jesus proclaims himself as God's refreshing water of joy that the sorrows and wounds and worries of darkness cannot dry out. And that claim has inspired countless people across the ages. Time after time, they have faced dark realities, gone the extra mile, stood up again after having been knocked down, and refused to blink or bow in the face of oppression because they had a relationship with God that fed their spirits and renewed their faith despite the darkness. I know this is mystical talk, but that doesn't make it any less real. In his 2007 book, Living Faith, How Faith Inspires Social Justice, Curtis Paul DeYoung highlights the power of faith in the lives of people he calls visionary activists. I like that term. Visionary activists. Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, Mohandas Gandhi, Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, Malcolm X, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Alec Bosak, Aung San Suu Kyi, that's the Buddhist woman whose leadership of the freedom movement in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, during the 1980s and 90s resulted in her being given the 1991 Nobel Prize, but she couldn't accept it until this year because she was under house arrest. She couldn't even be visited by her husband on his dying illness because she was under house arrest. She couldn't even receive a visit from her children because she was under house arrest. And she still kept going. She and so many other people proved that faith can strengthen us to endure anything and everything that darkness throws our way. Yeah, the darkness is real, but the bread of life is more real. The darkness is powerful, but it cannot overpower the bread of life. The darkness is oppressive, but it cannot hold the bread of life hostage or captive. The darkness is draining, but the bread of life renews our strength nevertheless. In Jesus Christ, God has supersized what Elijah experienced by showing up as food for the world, not just for one person. In Jesus, God inserted God's self into our darkness and faced it with us and has taken it on for us. In Jesus Christ, God met our darkness in all the places it lurks and whipped it. In Jesus, God met our darkness in Gethsemane, before crooked religious and imperial politicians, and even before the tyranny of imperial power at Calvary. And in Jesus Christ, the bread of life, God has met and overcome the dark reality of death. That's what we affirm and celebrate by his resurrection. The dark realities of life can't overwhelm people who are living in the strength of the bread of life. When the angel awakened Elijah and offered fresh bread and water, Elijah had to decide something. He had to decide whether to get up and take the bread and drink the water or keep laying around. You understand, God provides the bread and water. God doesn't force feed us. The same is true for our world and for each of us. God has provided the bread of life to strengthen us to overcome our dark realities. But each person must choose whether to accept its strength for life that is darkness-proof and death-proof, or just keep lying around. As followers of Jesus Christ, you and I are messengers of this good news to people who face the dark side of life. And so my word to you is pass the bread. Pass the bread. We have received the bread of life. Pass the bread. Pass the bread on to people who are dealing with dark side realities. Don't hog the bread. Pass the bread. You and I are angels to this good news to one another and to our world. Pass the bread. We are the current evidence that the bread of life still gives strength to press onward and overcome the darkness. Pass the bread. And thank God for the bread of